Do you remember the board game called Life? We used to play it with my kid, and it was super fun, some good lessons in there, and also some ones that did not stand the test of time. Like, do I have to get married? Do I have to have a blue little peg in my car? A little absurd. Flash forward today, and I think there are lots of economic lessons that we want to teach our young people that even grown-ups could benefit from thinking through in a more fulsome way. But how do you actually win the real game of life? Daryl Fairweather is the chief economist at Redfin. She is also the author of a book called Hate the Game: Economic Cheat Codes for Life, Love, and Work. She joins us from Williams Bay, Wisconsin. Hello there.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. You dedicate the book to all the haters. What does it mean to hate the game?
So, to be a hater, according to my book, is to acknowledge that the economic system we exist in is unfair, but still be willing to compete in it and to try to succeed in it, and to also have a sense of responsibility to try to help other people succeed and make things more fair overall.
Really, we're holding the paradox of two truths existing at the same time, which is something I think is critical for everybody to learn. And you outline so well in your book. You include a lot of your personal story here. I mean, grandma's on page 3 or something like that. You've got a PhD in economics. You could have gone full throttle academic on this. Why was it so important to weave in your story?
Woven my story was that I really wanted this to be the kind of book where if somebody picked it up, they would read it all the way to the end. So many nonfiction books that I read, I feel like I get the gist by the introduction. But for this, I really wanted there to be something that made people want to keep reading. And I realized that I needed a story, and I knew my story the best. And I thought that also it would work. It would keep me honest in terms of all the material in the book is something that I use to advance my career. It's not just economics for the sake of economics. I really wanted to ground it in what's been practically useful for me.
One of the foundational concepts, both of your book and of economics, is game theory. For those who didn't study it, or it was decades ago, like me, remind us what that term means and then how it applies to what you're trying to do here.
Game theory is like the building blocks of economics. When you think about the price of any good or service, say the price of a home, what's really happening is that the buyer and the seller are engaging in a negotiation to determine what the price is. If there are more buyers than sellers and the buyer has not as much power because the seller can just walk away and find another buyer. And if there are more sellers than buyers, then the seller doesn't have as much power because the buyer can walk away and find another home for sale. So at the foundation, we have these games happening that determine the overall economics of how much things cost and what's available for sale.
In any game you play, it's important to have some sense for what your advantages are and disadvantages are in the game. How do you determine that in the areas that you're focused on in the book? So, life, work, love, all those things.
Well, I went through the chapters of my own life to kind of figure out where economics was relevant. And I found that it was very relevant in terms of deciding what career to pursue, deciding what jobs to apply for, how to get promoted. But then also in my personal life, I use economics all the time, like when I am engaging in negotiations with my husband or other family members, or when I'm trying to think about the trade offs between working versus spending time with my family and being a parent. Economics really is a part of all of that in terms of how I decide what choices I want to make.
I love that you used the word negotiation when you referenced what I would call conversations with my husband. You actually used the word negotiation. What's an example of that? What does that mean?
Well, a negotiation that I think is really relevant for all couples is where to live. I mean, if you didn't meet your husband, say in high school and lived in the same exact town your whole life, it's going to come up. Where do you decide to live? And you might not want exactly the same things. And when two parties don't want exactly the same thing, they have to come to some kind of a compromise. But really, a compromise is just another word for a negotiation. And in determining like where to live, you have to think about, well, how much is each partner going to earn, which partner is going to be the primary earner, and which partner maybe is going to be handling more of the household duties, whose family is going to be around to help or to just be around for support. So all of that, I think, is a negotiation that has to happen because two sides aren't going to want exactly the same things.
And you make a really compelling case as to how important marriage is. Are you saying we need to marry for economic benefit instead of love? Is this the takeaway from your book?
I think that all decisions really come down to economics. I mean, love is like is the product of the marriage that makes it worthwhile, in my opinion. But you can still think of it as a product, and you have to put inputs into that in order to produce something. Gary Becker is an economist who modeled a family like a firm, and Emily Oster has also expanded on that work. And I think thinking about the family as a firm where it produces love or satisfaction or children or whatever it is that you want to produce is one way to apply economic principles and come up with, what's the best path forward.
Your grandma and your dad said, how about engineering at MIT? That's a really great idea. You chose economics. What does that say about your husband?
Well, I mean, I chose economics because I was just really interested in it. And I thought that it was something that I could commit to and study more than mechanical engineering, which is what I initially thought I was going to do. I liked physics and I thought that engineering would be an extension of that, but I'm really not interested in mechanical things as much as I'm interested in people. But my husband, he did study engineering, and his focus was on nuclear science. And it
Okay,
comes
so
up a lot, metaphors about melting down.
the point that our listeners should take away is you do write about how I think it was your dad said business people, I don't know, they're too in it, they're too self-centered. Engineers now.
Yeah,
That's
it's
good.
my grandma who said that.
Your grandma. So you did follow your grandma's advice, despite the
Yeah,
fact that her marital longevity was a little sketchy.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, she was married 5
Housing.
times.
Housing is another big deal. You highlight some of the biases that you argue can cloud our decisions in this area. As an example, the kind of weather that it is outside when you're visiting the home. Does this mean we only go to open houses on rainy days?
Well, whenever there is a major weather event, we see it in our housing market data at Redfin that tours just fall off a cliff. So if you're trying to sell a home in the middle of a snowstorm, I would advise just to wait and not list it that week, because it does matter how many people view your home, whether it's on the app or in person that first week. That's what determines how many offers you're going to get. And it's a really good idea to try to time all those offers together so that you can get a bidding war going. If you kind of miss it on the first time and then offers come in slowly after that, people start to think something's wrong with the home, like why didn't it sell initially? And it can be a real scarlet letter. So that timing, it really does matter.
And for buyers, you caution against doing too much fantasizing about what your life will look like in the home. Isn't that kind of the best part of home shopping?
I think that's maybe the most fun about looking at homes when you're not really all that interested, just
Okay,
daydreaming
that's
by
me.
browsing Redfin or maybe going on actual open tours. But if you're actually serious about making an offer on a home, I would say like don't get emotionally invested, because when somebody else starts bidding on it, it's going to be really hard to walk away, even if it's something that you can't afford, or it might be, you might not see the things that are wrong with it. You might start coming up with excuses for, like, the noisy neighbor or these other things that might turn off other buyers if you get so attached to it.
Spending is a huge challenge for so many people in the consumer culture that we live in today. What does the game teach us in terms of how to navigate that?
Well, there's this concept called conspicuous consumption that I go through in the book, which is basically buying goods or products to make it seem like you're of a higher social status. Buying expensive jewelry, buying expensive brands, even buying a fancy house. It all signals to the outside world that you are successful, that you are doing well in life, that you have taste, whatever it is, which can seem pretty frivolous, especially if that's the thing that you keep spending your money on. If you're seeking out status, you're going to end up spending a lot of money on something that really doesn't have any resale value, for example. But there are some reasons to signal to the world what your status is. Like if you're going into a negotiation for salary, you don't want the other person thinking that you can't get another better paying job. So it might be a good idea to dress like you can get really good jobs, or act like somebody who is willing to walk away from the negotiation. I think sending out signals is important, and also it's important to understand how those signals are being received.
You talk about cheat codes. It's in the title of the book. What does it mean? What does that phrase mean? And what are some examples?
Well, to me, a cheat code is really just understanding economic principles. It's not really cheating at all, but it is like one example I think is gathering information so that there isn't an information asymmetry. In negotiations, like one of the main determinants of how a negotiation will go is knowing what your options are outside of the negotiation, but also knowing what the other person's options are. And they might be trying to conceal that from you. They might be trying to seem like they are really willing to walk away from the negotiation when actually they really need you. So gathering that information and being able to understand what other people have and what they can walk away to is really important in order to know how far you can push a negotiation.
Your lived experience is so helpful. At least it was for me in reading the book, because there's a credibility for you and your life story that helps identify what a lot of people, I think, probably get tripped up on, and that is the distinction or the difference between the perception of power and actual power. How do you reconcile those two things, especially for people who really like grew up in a world where they're like, none of that's available to me because of the gender or the race or the sexual orientation or my mental health or whatever it is? How do you get over that? Maybe getting over is even the wrong way to frame it.
Yeah, I mean, one thing to talk about in the introduction is that they're like gatekeepers to getting into a career field or advance or getting information. There are people who might like shut the gate to you and say that you can't have this information or you can't pass down this career path. But there are so many different career paths to go on, so many games to choose from that you can play that if somebody tells you no, it just means that you need to look somewhere else. And that's probably not the game you want to be playing anyway. And also understanding backward induction, I think, can help you identify who is actually in your way and who isn't. Like when
Mm.
I talk about getting promoted in the book, I identified that it was really the vice president and who was in charge of who ended up getting promoted in the end. So knowing that meant that I didn't really have to worry about some manager who was above me in level, but wasn't the vice president because like their opinion didn't really matter in terms of me getting promoted. So knowing who actually matters, I think can give you more confidence and give you the ability to not care so much if maybe you get on somebody's bad side because of who you are or what you've done.
With any game we play, there is some practice, some failure, but we're hoping to develop skills to get better at the game over time. If you had to choose one skill, and the book has many, many, many skills, if you had to choose one skill that you would offer or recommend people to get good at that would make the biggest difference in their life, which one would you choose?
The thing that I think holds people back is getting too much in their heads and not being able to like remove themselves and see things from an outside perspective. I think just the act of like putting yourself in someone else's shoes or putting yourself in the shoes of a friend who's trying to give yourself advice can help remove a lot of the behavioral biases that lead to bad decisions, like the status quo bias or hurting behavior when you do what other people are doing. Like just kind of taking the emotion out of it and trying to see things objectively, like it is just a game where it's not the biggest deal in the world if you lose, can really help.
Great. Really insightful stuff, Daryl. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Daryl Fairweather is the author of Hate the Game: Economic Cheat Codes for Life, Love, and Work.